So one of the things we have to remember is any complex memory phenomenon probably, taps into more than one of these memory sins. There's not typically going to be a one-to-one mapping between something as complicated as confabulation.
You just heard Dan Schacter from Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Garth and guest host Jane Halonen from the University of West Florida interviewed Dan as part of the Psych Sessions 2023 East Coast Tour for episode 186 of Psych Sessions, Conversations about Teaching and Stuff.
Psych Sessions is proud to partner with Macmillan Learning. At Macmillan Learning Psychology, content matters, and these days, digital content matters more than ever. Macmillan Learning's Achieve elevates interactive teaching and learning with an extraordinary range of online course content in a powerful yet easy-to-use platform. Interactive ebooks, innovative assessments, engaging videos and activities, helpful instructor resources. Achieve brings it all together and makes it easy for you to find what you need and what you want. See for yourself. Go to macmillanlearning.com/psych sessions for an introductory tour today. Macmillan's Achieve for Psychology, engaging every student, supporting every instructor, setting the new standard for teaching and learning.
The Psych Sessions podcast is sponsored by STP. That is the Society for the Teaching of Psychology. That's APA Division 2. You can find them at teachpsych.org. The views or product endorsements expressed do not represent the views, support, or endorsements of STP. Psych Sessions is so grateful to have STP as a long-term supporter.
Colleagues, do you want to learn more about how you can easily integrate learning strategies into your Intro Psych course? Then sign up for a demo of the Intro Psych book, Psychology in Your Life, and W.W. Norton will give you a $25 gift card for your time. Here's why you should consider it. You've probably noticed that after 2 years of remote learning, your students need some extra support in learning how to study, especially in Intro Psych. So what if you could incorporate study skills directly into the content you're already covering in your course? Sarah Grisson, author of Psychology in Your Life, has offered us this integration. Here's what she did. First, she analyzed the learning science research to find 6 learning impact strategies that would be most helpful to college students, and then she synthesized them into the IMPACT model. IMPACT stands for improving, monitoring, practicing, attending, connecting, and thinking deeply. There are impact learning pauses throughout the book that offer study tips and just-in-time learning hacks. And Inquisitive, Norton's award-winning adaptive assessment, also includes questions on the impact strategies and incorporates these learning tips into Inquisitive's answer-specific question feedback. You're going to want to try this demo out, and they're going to give you a $25 gift card. So sign up for the demo of Psychology in Your Life by going to siegel.wwnorton.com/psych sessions. That's Siegel, like the bird, SEAGULL.wwnorton.com/psych sessions. Hi, folks. This is Garth, and you've heard Dan Schacter at Harvard University talking about, guess what? Memory. Dan has researched memory his entire professional career, and Jane Halonen and I had the opportunity to go to Harvard and sit down with Dan in his office and just ask him every question we could possibly think of. And it went in some really interesting and unexpected directions. Jane, what sticks out to you about our interview with Dan?
Well, let's start with the fact that we were sitting in William James Hall talking to someone who clearly has multiple links to William James, including awards that are William James awards. So that was a heady experience right there. But then to discover that Dan was as personable and easy to relate to, filled with historical detail, interesting stories, it turned out to be a real pleasure to talk with him.
We asked him questions like, what is your favorite study that you have ever done? And that was a fun answer. He also went deep into some history that I think folks will find really interesting, related to his prized possession. In fact, I think that might be bonus content. So if you don't hear that come through here, just wait for it, folks, because we did get some kind of B-roll of Dan after the interview was officially over. But Jane, I just remember him lighting up when we were talking about some of these things. That was so fun for me.
I agree. I especially liked when I asked him, was it true that he published a whole book as a graduate student? And that, I think, got us off and running because we tapped into a passion project, and how lucky for him that he was able to find something that was that galvanizing so early in his career. But clearly it was very motivating for him, and it was great to have a platform to talk about that.
Dan Schacter is one of the amazing historical contributors to the discipline, and we are so thankful to him for taking the time out to sit down with us. And here he is, Dan Schacter from Harvard University on Psych Sessions. Hi, everyone. This is Garth, and I am sitting across, first of all, from Jane Halonen, who is on this East Coast tour with me to interview some contributors, amazing professors and teachers of psychology. And we are sitting collectively across from the William R. Keenan Professor of Psychology here at Harvard University, Dr. Dan Schacter, and it is an honor to be with you today. And thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Oh, I'm happy to do it and look forward to our conversation.
Great. Well, we've done a little bit of homework, Dan. So we are hoping that to get lots of to ask all the questions that probably people have wanted to ask for a long time. Maybe some people have, but our audience may not know the answer to these questions. And so, you mentioned when we got into your office today, this office looked familiar because I've seen it in videos before. And I just wanted to start here because my point of connection, one of my early points of connection with you with regards to teaching was the video you did, the video series as a part of the Alan Alda. I think it was a Scientific America video series. Was that
Scientific American Frontiers?
Frontiers,
yeah.
Right. How did that come about? Just personal interest? Could we just jump in there?
Yeah, that was just an email or a phone call from somebody who was working on that show, which I knew about a little bit, that Alan Alda hosted. He or she said, I don't remember exactly who contacted me, that they were doing something on memory. Would I be interested in participating? And Alan Alda would be the host. And I said, sure, that sounded very interesting. This is I believe it was 1995. The show aired in 1996. And so then I worked a little with the producers on how we might go about putting together a show on memory that would involve some interview and some demonstrations with Alan Alda, who turned out to be, as nice a guy off camera as he appears to be on camera. He was fantastic to work with. And so I think the first thing we did was they were interested in having some kind of everyday memory example in which they were hoping that we might be able to demonstrate some kind of memory distortion or false memory, if you want to use that term, in the host, in Alan Alda. And so we came up with a version of an experimental paradigm we had been working with in the lab, in which in the laboratory version, people would see a video, people carrying out various kinds of activities. Then later on, we would show them some photographs and ask them whether they remembered these photographs being in the video, and we would slip in some photographs that could have been in there that would have fit but were not. And later on, we would do a final memory test, and we found that in some cases, people would exhibit the phenomenon of source memory confusion, where they would claim that an event depicted only in a photo had actually been in the original video. We had published on that and had shown particularly older adults were susceptible to that sort of source memory confusion. So could we come up with something in an everyday setting where we might be able to observe something like that in Alan Alda? So they came up with this idea of putting together a picnic scene in a park. Right. It's actually in Brookline, Massachusetts, not here in Cambridge where we are now on the Harvard campus, but a few miles away in Brookline. And they scripted out this scene and ran it by me. And I told them, I thought that could plausibly work, where he and I would watch these two actors going through the motions of a picnic. Then later on, a couple days later, we'd come back to my office and I would show him some pictures and I would ask him whether he remembered those pictures, what he thought, and I would slip in some new pictures. And so the first time I met Alan Alda was literally, we shook hands and we walked into the scene. I'd never met him before. And we just started talking and we walked over to where the picnic was being held. And he watched and made some kind of funny comments about what was going on because it was a bit forced. And then we came back to my office and he was kind of on to me. So I was showing him these photos and he would see something that wasn't there, said, "Hey, that wasn't there.
That's right.
Don't think you're going to fool me." Yet he did exhibit the phenomenon several times where he claimed later on that, that was in the scene out in Brookline. That was actually in the park. Nope, it was just a photograph that was shown here. So he was a good sport about it. And it was a fun experiment to do. It might have been a complete flop, but it actually did work. And then I think I also did a induction of what many people will be familiar with as known as the Diess-Roediger-McDermott or DRM false memory paradigm. So this is where you read a list of associated words and then you test people's memory. And, if it's candy, sour, sugar, bitter, good, taste, tooth, nice, honey, soda, chocolate, hard, cake, eat, pie. I know these lists very well. Later on, people will often claim that sweet was one of the words in the list, and it wasn't, but you false alarm because it's associated to everything that was in the list. And I was able to get Alan Alda, again, even though he was very suspicious, what are you up to here? Oh, I know what you're up to, but he still exhibited the phenomenon, showing how robust it is.
You know what was so great about those videos, or that video in particular? Well, first of all, it was comical. Everything. Yeah. I mean, he just brought that to it. But what you did and what they did was brought memory into the lives of everyday people, and it made you think, well, what is going on in my life that I am not seeing, or that I'm misremembering, or I'm adding to? It's so easy for students to understand what that was. So it was very well done. So thanks, I guess. And thanks to those folks. And Alan's, pretty good to work with, it looks like.
He really is. He's a terrific guy. And it's up on YouTube, and so people still get to see it.
Who were the actors? Because, it was a bit forced, but that was part of the fun.
Yeah, I think they were young professional actors, maybe acquaintances of the producer who was based here in Boston. Yeah.
And then after you and Alan left, that's when they took more photos of the picnic.
Yes, right? Exactly right.
Well, fantastic. Thanks for indulging me to just ask you about that. So it's hard to know where to start with you because you've contributed so much to this area of psychology. And so maybe I can just jump in and say, you've been at this for a while, right?
Yes.
You're shaking your head. I have two questions. One is I want to know one of your favorite studies that you've done. And it could be like what's the most fun to do or what was the most meaningful, and then also how things have changed over time. So I don't know which question you want to take first, but is there a study that sticks out to you that you had a lot of fun doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard to pick out one because there've been a lot of ones that have been fun and been important. The one that was the most fun probably is not the one that is the best known of anything that I've been involved in, but It was one that I did shortly after receiving my PhD from the University of Toronto in 1981. I was at that time directing what we called the Unit for Memory Disorders. This was like a research-based group that I led, focused on studying patients with various kinds of brain damage and memory problems. We had received a grant from the University of Toronto, who was giving out a couple of large grants every year to novel projects that they thought were promising. And so I, along with my colleagues, Endel Tulving, who had been my PhD supervisor, Maris Moskovich, a well-known neuropsychologist, got a grant to set up this unit for memory disorders. And we had all these really interesting patients. One of them was, at that time, in the relatively early stages of Alzheimer's disease. And this is 1981, 1982, so it wasn't nearly as extensively studied as it has been in recent years, who was about as amnesic as any patient you're ever going to see, even though cognitively he was still, hanging in there. He was not fully demented by any means, but he failed miserably on virtually every laboratory test. And I was wondering, how can I really capture this in an everyday setting? So occasionally we would have conversations about our common interests, and it turns out we both like to play golf. So I started thinking, how would a guy like this behave in a round of golf? Because golf taps various kinds of memory. You've got to remember, where you just hit your ball, how many strokes you had. That's episodic memory.
You have to remember to keep your head down.
That's something that we often don't do as golfers, but yes, that's true. There's a lot of jargon, birdie, divot, chip shot, semantic memory, and then there's the skill of hitting, procedural memory. So it taps those different kinds of memory. So I took the guy out, and I played 2 rounds of golf with him at the public course in Toronto, Don Valley Golf Course, and I documented what I observed. So after each hole, I had a tape recorder with me, and I'd ask him, to tell me what he had just done on the hole, so I could get his memory for the hole, for what happened on each hole. I looked at his ability to remember where he had hit the ball, and I even got a little experimental manipulation in there, being an experimental psychologist. So half the time, he would hit first and could go look for his ball right away, and on the other half the holes, I would hit first. It was the opposite. When he hit first and I would hit second, that would introduce a delay. And when I hit first and he hit second, then he could go look for his ball right away. Anyway, it was really striking in that if he hit second after me and could hold in mind where he just hit his shot, he could go find it almost every time. But when he hit first and had to wait for me, then he almost never could remember where he'd hit his ball. And there are, striking examples where he hit a great drive. He carried a creek 150 yards out. He knew it was a great drive, having played that course before. And then I hit my drive. And then he starts walking down the fairway. He said, "Oh, did I hit my shot?" A minute ago, he was just, so excited about the great shot he had hit. Makes the point that even for strongly encoded events, a severely amnesic patient is not going to be able to recall them. And he could hardly remember any of his strokes when I interviewed him after each hole. But on the other hand, he exhibited, as far as I could tell, entirely normal use of golf terminology, all the semantic memory terminology. He knew what a birdie was. He knew what a chip shot was. So as far as I could tell, based on what I did, his semantic memory is intact. And he played to his handicap. In other words, he played about the way he had been playing even before he became amnesic. So the skill of golf was there. And I wrote this up and I published it in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology, which is considered a pretty good journal of psychology. So
yeah, it's a pretty good journal.
Yeah. So I have to say that was just so much fun. It was a long time ago now, but that one really stands out to me.
As a golfer, I have to ask who won the match.
I think I edged him out. And even if I had not, I could say that, and he couldn't contradict me.
we've told some friends of ours that we were coming to interview you, people who have maybe run into you over the years, and it did come up. Two things have already come up. University of Toronto, which I couldn't remember. I saw on your desk that you had a magazine from the University of Toronto. I think I said, I think Dan went to the University of Toronto. And then the other thing was golf sticks out to people. So do you still play golf?
Yeah, I do. I still play. Yeah, absolutely. I play a couple of times a week here. I play a variety of courses, but mostly at a very good course in Boston called George Wright Golf Course, where I play in a league on the weekends and I play with some friends during the week. So
I'd say he still plays.
Yeah.
I'm still at it.
I love that you could bring your professional interests together with your personal interests. That's pretty neat. It's a good lesson for students actually, that they can apply what they're learning to what they love as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One of the other facts that, it might not be true, but one of the other facts that was reported about you is that you actually published a book while you were in graduate school.
That is true.
Huh.
Yeah.
How?
I'll tell you about it.
Okay.
Now, we're only audio, but this is the book. It actually has come out under two different titles.
Okay.
That title is Forgotten Ideas, Neglected Pioneers.
Richard Semon and the Story of Memory. The original title was Stranger Behind the Engram. That all got started my first year of graduate school, which was 1976, 1977. And I came to the University of Toronto to study memory with Endel Tulving. And that emanated a little bit more of the backstory from having just worked for 2 years as a research assistant at Duke University in the Durham VA Hospital in the laboratory of a psychologist named Herb Krovitz, who hired me as his research assistant. I was an undergraduate at nearby University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where I'd been focused on clinical psychology, but toward the end of my time there, got more interested in experimental psychology, and through some mutual colleagues, was introduced to Krovitz. He hired me. I got to test amnesic patients, got very interested in memory. And then the University of Toronto with Tulving, Fergus Craik, Ben Murdoch, Morris Moskovich, was a great center of memory research. So I went there. And this is my first year of graduate school. And of course, I was reading, pretty much everything Tulving was publishing, my PhD supervisor. And so he wrote an article in a book that came out this year. It was called Ekphoric Processes in Recall and Recognition. And the first word there is kind of a strange word, ekphoric. What is that? I wondered, and I read the article. And ekphoric came from the term ekphory. Ekphory was a term that was made up by the German biologist Richard Semon to refer to the process of retrieving a memory. It was Richard Semon. I'd never heard of the guy. And so there were a couple of references in Tulving's article to Semon. And I said, well, why would anybody who was, he wrote 2 books in the first decade of the 20th century about memory. Why would anybody feel the need to make up this strange term ekphory to refer to memory retrieval? So I got interested in who was Semon. I literally just went to the library. I took out his books, which had been initially written in German and then were translated into English. So I read the, parts of the English translations. And what I saw is that way back then in the first decade of the 20th century, Richard Semon had come up with this really strikingly modern framework for viewing memory. And in that, as part of that framework, he felt the need to invent his own terminology to talk about memory. So one of the terms that he came up with is the one thing that kind of lived on, which is the term engram, to refer to the memory trace, the representation of that is left by an experience, persisting representation in the brain. That's familiar to psychologists, in part because of a famous paper by Carl Lashley written in late 40s called In Search of the Engram, where he was looking for the memory trace and he could never find it. And most people think it was Lashley who came up with that term. It wasn't Lashley. It was this guy, Richard Semon. So I started reading his books and I was really just so impressed by what I read, not only, and then in the course of reading it, I realized that part of the reason why he came up with this novel term ekphory for memory retrieval was part of, in general, again, he thought you had to invent your own terms to be very precise about what you're referring to and not get brought down by or burdened by, the connotations of everyday language. And ekphory, he gave special emphasis to because he kind of criticized researchers of the time, psychologists and biologists who are interested in memory, for focusing on the conditions for forming memories at the expense of paying attention to the conditions that impacted retrieval of memories, or ekphory. And he placed a lot of emphasis on what I termed the conditions, functions, and processes of retrieval. So I got really interested in this guy who Tulving was the one who initially come across him and made very brief reference to him. So I talked to my fellow graduate student at that time, Eric Ike, and to Tulving about the idea of writing up an article to give this guy his due, because nobody had ever heard of him. We should, memory researchers should be aware of him. So they thought, yeah, that's a good idea. So the three of us wrote an article. I took the lead on it, and I started writing that article in my second year of graduate school, 77, 78, part of which I spent in Oxford with Endel Tulving, who was there on a sabbatical. And for various reasons, it made sense for me to go over there and spend some time in Oxford with him during that sabbatical, primarily because at Oxford at the time was Professor Lawrence Weiskrantz, who was one of the leaders in amnesia research. He had done these really important studies with Elizabeth Warrington Weiskrantz, very famous studies of preserved memory functions in amnesic patients that had been published in the 1970s. And I thought, wow, this would be great if I could, have some discussions with Weiskrantz and Tulving thought that would also be good. So I managed to go over there. And then while I was over there, I was working on this article on Richard Semon, and I had access to, a lot of good libraries, and I started finding out more about him, and that he had led a really interesting life with all kinds of personal ups and downs. He had worked with a really interesting mentor. He had started out as a biologist working at the University of Jena in Munich. He had led expeditions for the missing link, which was something that evolutionary biologists of the time spent a lot of time on in this kind of post-Darwin era of the late 19th century. And then mysteriously, he'd been working at the University of Jena. He's become very well respected, and he then mysteriously departed Jena, and then starts writing these books about memory several years later, based in Munich. So what happened to him? Why? He was now a private scholar in Munich. Turned out he had had an affair with the wife of a famous professor at Jena.
Uh-oh.
And this was not acceptable at the time, and the two of them were literally run out of town. He had to give up his position at the university, and she, Maria Krell, who was the wife of this famous professor, Ludolf Krell, I think his name was, she decided she'd, rather pursue a new life with Semon than, remain with her husband and children. So they went off to Munich, and that's where he started working on these books. So there's this whole interesting story. And then sadly, she dies of cancer during World War I. He's distressed by that, obviously destroyed by that. He's upset by the lack of recognition of his work, which was never recognized really in his time, upset about the fate of Germany in the war, and he ends up taking his own life in 1918. Oh. So I kind of got drawn in by the story as well as, giving Semon his due for his important contributions, and then more generally started thinking through the implications of a story like this for, psychology and history of science. Why would a contribution like Simmons that, in hindsight, in the 1970s, you could see, wow, this guy really, had a lot of worthwhile things to say. Why was he ignored? And so then I sort of got this idea for expanding this article into a book that would go into his personal story, talk about, his theory of memory and put it in a broader context of history and psychology of science. Larry Earlbaum, who had just started Lawrence Earlbaum Associates in the 1970s, was good friends with Endel Tulving, visited Oxford, and I sort of gave him a pitch for this crazy idea.
And you're still a graduate student.
Yeah, like a second-year graduate student. I had actually published a couple of papers before coming to graduate school, but still, completely unknown, and there's no reason anybody should take a chance on me writing that book. But for whatever reason, he did, and I kind of just kept it going in the background while doing the normal things that a graduate student does, doing experiments and everything else during that time. And, it was just like a labor of love. Something that if you really feel strongly about something, you find a way to get it done. And so I did, and it was published in 1982 under the title Stranger Behind the Engram, Theories of Memory and the Psychology of Science. And then when I became better known 20 years later, I'd published a book Searching for Memory in 96 and The Seven Sins of Memory in 2001. Psychology Press decided to bring it out under a different title and with a nicer cover than Earlbaum ever gave me.
Yes, it's a very nice cover.
Yeah, it is a nice cover.
Did you understand at the time that you were working on this passion project how odd, how atypical it was for a graduate student to be able to do that?
Yeah, and I was fully aware that I was taking a risk, that it was very unusual, but I loved doing it. Mm. And Tulving was supportive of it. Again, it was kind of, I had my day job and my night job, and that was my night job. Yeah. And my day job was running experiments on memory.
Have you ever had a situation like that again in your career where you felt tapped internally to do something that was a little out of the ordinary?
Not to that extent, no. Yeah. So, I think it's fairly normal for anyone in our field to always have, you always have multiple projects going of various kinds. But I don't think anything I've done subsequently would be that, out of the ordinary as compared to writing that book. But, I'm glad I did it.
In your, I know you've written an intro psych textbook with some colleagues. Do you give this a brief history? Because there's very limited room in an intro psych book to add all the history we'd like to, but do you put it in there?
A little bit. Yeah. There's a little bit in there, but you can't spend much time on something like this in an intro psych book.
Yeah, we may circle back to the intro psych book, but if I could, when even before you get to the University of Toronto, can I ask where did you grow up, and then what was I don't know, elementary, high school like for you? Did you have aspirations to study in college and go on from there?
Yeah, I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and then my parents moved out to the Westchester County suburbs when I was very young in the mid-50s. And I went to elementary school in New Rochelle, New York, George M. Davis Elementary School. And then we moved when I was between 5th and 6th grade. It was summer of 1963. We moved to nearby Scarsdale. And so I went to the Scarsdale schools for middle school, junior high school was called then, and high school. And I that's where I developed my interest in psychology, was in high school. In Scarsdale High School, it was either junior or senior year. I took a course that I think was called, a course in like human health, something like that had a big section on psychology, and I immediately got drawn into that. I wrote a couple of papers for that course, brief papers on psychology, and so by the time I was thinking about going to college, I pretty much already knew I wanted to be a psychology major, and I really have to give credit to that course I took in high school for directing me. Then when I started thinking about where I wanted to go to college, and then we have to go back to golf, because I was pretty good at golf in high school, much better then than I am now. And I was captain of the golf team. I won the club championship at the club where my parents belonged at the end of my junior year. And so I had fantasies maybe of playing on like a good college golf team. And that got me thinking about going south. And so I remember we visited several different of the major colleges in the South, like University of Virginia, Duke, UNC Chapel Hill. And I really fell in love with UNC Chapel Hill. And so I ended up going there. I didn't end up playing golf there because my game sort of slacked off a little bit. Senior year wasn't as good as it was junior year. And I played maybe one 9-hole round with a couple of guys who were on the team, and I could see that I was not nearly as good as they were.
What kind of handicap are we talking your junior year of high school?
I think the lowest I ever got was either a 3 or a 4.
Oh my goodness.
Which is pretty good. I mean, when I won the club championship, these are numbers that have always stuck with me. We had 4 rounds of play. I shot 73, 79, 78, 78 to win. Now that's, I occasionally break 80 now, but that would be more of a fluke. So that was about how I played. But compared to like the college golfers of the time, that was still really not in their league, but somehow it was enough to get me down there.
And you said you visited some colleges. So your folks were supportive of you going to college?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Did they go to college?
Yeah. Yeah. My father went to Fordham and my mother went to NYU. So they were both local.
And what did they do for a living?
My father was an insurance broker and my mother was a reading teacher.
A reading teacher. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So let's pick it up then. You decide not to do golf because you're not going to make it, and you put all that effort into school.
Yeah, I started putting that effort into school, particularly starting in my junior year, really focusing on psychology, and clinical psychology was my main interest then. I took some courses that I really liked. Bernadette Gray Little, who was a personality psychologist who went on to become the president of the University of Kansas, was particularly important to me at UNC Chapel Hill. I remember taking a course with her. I did an independent study with her. And I was also involved in some clinical projects focusing on self-injurious behavior and mentally challenged children and adolescents. And in fact, my senior year, I had signed on to be a research assistant on such a project after I graduated. And then through some, as I mentioned earlier, some friends of mine who knew Herb Krovitz, who knew that I was getting increasingly interested in experimental psychology, they put me in touch with Herb Krovitz, and we really hit it off. He offered me this position, and then I had this terrible conflict of I've already committed to doing something that I don't really feel like I want to do now. A couple of sleepless nights, but I decided, I better go with what I think is what I really want to do. And so I ended up taking the position with Krovitz and working for 2 years at the Durham VA and in the Duke Psychology Department where he was based.
And then to Toronto after that.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And at Toronto, one of the themes that we have been discovering in a lot of the interviews we've been doing is that many people say graduate school was the best time of my life. And would you describe that as something that was that powerful, or was it maybe not quite so good? Or?
No, it was good. It was good. I wouldn't say it was the best time of my life, but it was a good time. It was, we had a great group of people in Toronto, the faculty. I mentioned earlier, you had Tulving, my supervisor, Gus Craig, Ben Murdoch, Paul Kohlers, who sadly passed away in the 1980s, but was a very important cognitive psychologist. Morris Moscovich was there, Colin McLeod, a young faculty member. These were all people, Norman Slameka, all people who were very, influential in memory research. So you really couldn't be in a better atmosphere. And then there were a lot of really talented graduate students. So it was a tremendous place to be if you're interested in memory. And so I had a very good experience in graduate school, but had fortunate to have other good experiences as well.
You have worked at a few different places in your career. What was your first job out of graduate school?
Well, it was remaining at Toronto and having gotten this grant that I mentioned earlier to set up a unit for memory disorders. And so I was able to be the director, so to speak, of that unit. We had good resources to study, do a lot of studies of various kinds of patients with memory disorders. We had our own space. We had a few people, another PhD, psychometrist to do testing, research assistant. So that was really my first position, which didn't involve obligatory teaching. So it really gave me a lot of time to focus on the research. And I was fortunate to get something at that time. They also, in Canada, called the University Research Fellowship, which was kind of paid your salary and gave you an assistant professor status at the university where you got it. So I taught, a couple of courses during that period of time, but was mostly focused on research. And then in 1986, we were fortunate to get funding to keep the Unit for Memory Disorders going. But by that time, I had been in Toronto for quite a while, over a decade. And I was still working with some of the same people I'd been working with as a graduate student, and it was great. We were very productive, put out a lot of really good work. Then in February 1986, I went to a conference in Tucson that was organized by Lynn Nadell, among others. Lynn Nadell, of course, had become well-known through the important book by John O'Keefe and Lynn Nadell, The Hippocampus as a Cognitive Map, that had come out in 1978, and I had gotten to know him a little bit. He participated in a conference that I was also involved in Toronto in the early 80s. So Nadell had moved to University of Arizona. Lynn Cooper, well-known cognitive psychologist, had moved there. He invited me to go to this conference, and it's in the middle of February. It's beautiful in Tucson, and it's not so beautiful in Toronto. And they told me about all these exciting recruiting plans they had. They were I think they had just gotten Merrill Garrett, the MIT psycholinguist, and Ken Forster, an experimental psycholinguist from Australia, very well known, had committed to moving. John Kilstrom, a well-known personality psychologist, cognitive psychologist, had committed. Lynn Cooper, who I just mentioned, I think was already there at that time or about to move there. So it seemed like there was a lot of energy moving there. And I decided it was the time kind of to move on, do something different. And so I ended up getting recruited there and began in fall 1987, and I had a very good experience there. I was fortunate that I had done enough already that I came in with tenure as an associate professor to Arizona, and we had a great group. Got to play some more golf than I had been, because I had really played between 1970 and 1987 when I moved there. I was just playing a few rounds a year. I'm almost out of golf entirely. But got back into it. We had a good faculty group who played together, and it was really excellent scientific environment. It was really nice personally. My wife and I lived in a very nice house that we really liked. We liked Tucson. Then after a few years, Harvard came calling, and it was kind of a conflict. We really want to move, but there was a lot of opportunity here, and hard to turn down Harvard.
A little bit hard to turn down Harvard.
Yeah, so ended up moving here in 91.
Can I ask you a question about, and Jane, maybe you could speak to this. It sounds like the University of Arizona was putting together a dream team a little bit. Like somebody had the idea that we were going to bring in and make these offers to all these people and make it reminds me of the modern NBA actually a little bit of just
you're going to ask me a question about the NBA?
No.
That's good.
No, but is this something you've seen in higher education?
Sure.
Yeah. Is it
with institutions that are well funded in some capacity, whether privately or if a legislature decides they want to plus up an institution? Yes, that can happen, and it still happens.
And yet, it's probably not just money. So that's different than maybe basketball, but it's also relationships. It sounds like they were bringing together people who knew each other as well.
Yeah, I think it was built very smartly, and there was a kind of a cognitive science, interdisciplinary cognitive science vision at the heart of it, and that was embraced by a dean at the time, Miles Brand, who went on to become the president of Ohio State and the head of the NCAA. So he was very, very talented at putting things together. So it's an exciting time to be there. It was a hard place to leave. I still, have good colleagues and friends there and enjoy going back there.
I have to ask, what was it like to have Harvard come knocking on your door?
It was flattering, I suppose, that they were interested. And for me, it wasn't just the allure wasn't just Harvard. It was partly also that Boston is very strong center, or was and still is very strong center for neuropsychology of memory. And so the possibility of getting access to a really good population of amnesic patients, which I didn't really have at Arizona. We were hoping to build it, and we did to some extent. But here, Laird Cermak was over at the Boston VA hospital and had built up a really nice population of amnesic patients, and I became part of his center over there. So it was the combination, and also getting back closer to family who were in New York, and being back on the East Coast was kind of nice. But and I could also see that the Harvard department was going to be one that was going to be building, because there were a lot of, very eminent people who were on the brink of retirement then. Steve Koslin was here leading the charge for cognitive neuroscience. I think he was the main person behind bringing me here. And then we were able to bring in a lot of people in the ensuing years and kind of rebuilding the department in ways that, we and others were happy with. So it ended up being a good move. I've been here for 32 years, so I guess it must have been a good move.
What were the terms of that invitation? When you were coming to Harvard, were you teaching and doing research?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was fortunate. I came in, I had been promoted to full professor at Arizona. So I came in as a tenured full professor, which was nice. And, I've taught pretty much the normal teaching load here that anybody else teaches, except for the 10-year period when I was chair, from 1995 to 2005. And in order to be chair, something's got to give. And, it's not going to be research in a research intensive, institution like this. So you get a little bit of a teaching reduction. I taught throughout that time, but only, with a course reduction to allow you to devote sufficient time to being department chair.
Did you enjoy being a department chair? For 10 years, that says it couldn't have been awful.
I didn't hate it. Enjoy would probably be too strong a word to ever apply to being chair of a psychology department. And maybe for some people, I enjoyed aspects of it for sure. I'm just kidding around.
What parts did you like the best?
Oh, I think just getting things done, hiring people, making improvements in the department. We, getting more space when space was needed, things like that.
Were there any parts that you hated?
Oh, hate would be too strong a term. If I hated any of it, I couldn't have done it. That was basically 3 3-year terms with one sabbatical interspersed in there. That just, the headaches of sometimes getting, putting out fires that arise for the first time at 10:30 at night. You're about to go to sleep, and then you make the mistake of checking your email, and you see there's a problem that you have to deal with. That's the part I liked the least, and the part I liked the most was again getting things done that improved the life of the department, hiring, being able to be a big part of hiring new faculty, things like that. I found very satisfying, or I wouldn't have done it for 3 terms. The other thing to note is that part of the reason I was able to do it for 3 terms is that the department here is very functional. People really get along very well. We have very good administrative support. You need all of those things, I think, for the chair position to be something that's manageable. And like I said, enjoyable might be a little too strong of a term, but I obviously didn't mind it because I went through it 3 times.
Yep. You also, I suspect, have a special relationship with William James. I mean, it's not that we're just sitting in William James Hall, but as I look around your office, I see William James peppered throughout a lot of awards. I'm wondering, could you talk about why William James might be so special to you?
Well, I think just the combination of being in the building that is called William James Hall, having been in one of the houses where he lived, which is right around the corner, which at one time, the famous memory researcher Bill Estes, who had just retired when I came here, but was still around the department and someone I got to know. Obviously, one of the great all-time psychologists. He lived in a house that was previously a house where William James lived, and he had holiday gatherings around Christmas time where he'd invite the department over, and you would be in William James's library, which is an amazing
that would be
place.
So exciting.
It's a historical, place in Cambridge. So having that kind of connection, being in William James Hall, having been in his library, always having had some William James to teach, and when I would teach a memory course in terms of the history of memory, he had something to say about pretty much everything in psychology, and and having read more of his stuff when I was doing my historical project focused on Richard Semin, but of course you couldn't escape William James. What did William James have to say about some of these issues that I got into? So I think it's the combination of all those things for me.
I suppose we should talk about memory at some point,
Might be a good idea.
because you've devoted your life to the research of it. But before we get to that, I do want to ask you about just your teaching load here. And what do you mostly teach? Or are there classes that you prefer to teach?
What I've been doing the last number of years, really ever since I became chair, is a combination of I teach a cognitive neuroscience course. Been doing that jointly with Professor Elizabeth Phelps the last few years. We get to teach that together, and that's been a lot of fun. That's a stand-up lecture course. That's in the fall. Then in the spring, lately I've been teaching, and I have taught it off and on for a number of years, a freshman seminar called The 7 Sins of Memory, based on the book that I wrote. Of that title, and that's freshman seminars here are a lot of fun to teach. And when the book first came out in 2001, I was motivated to try to develop a seminar around it, and so I taught the freshman seminar. And then in ensuing years, I've taught that, and I've taught like an upper level memory course, one of those two, as my second sort of content course. And then we hear if we run a formal lab meeting for the entire year, that counts as like our final course. So, and I run a lab meeting every week. So that's what my teaching has been.
How large might your lab team be?
It's varied, from maybe to, depending if you count who you count, maybe from 8 to 15 people.
And all grad students, or is it a mix?
Graduate students, postdocs, a lab manager, and some undergraduates.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
All right. Before we get into memory, what your intro psych book has been? It's now in what, 7th edition?
We just finished
6th edition.
Yeah.
So you've been at that for a while. Can you just tell us how that came about? We do know some people who are intro psych authors. So yeah. One across from you here, and it's a different thing, right?
It's a very different thing.
Yeah. Can you just talk about it a little bit?
Yeah. I was approached by an editor who was in, I think it was 1999, who I guess got interested in me through research and also the book I'd written, Searching for Memory. Would I be interested in writing an introductory psychology textbook? I had never really thought about doing that before. And I was at that time, it was 99 or 2000, working on the 7 Sins of Memory book. And so when I started thinking was, maybe it would be interesting to approach the entire domain of psychology from this, like, not saying the 7 sins of social psychology or the 7 sins of perception, but looking at, the typical chapters in intro psych book through the lens of what can some of the errors that we make, errors and illusion, tell us about normal functioning. And in fact, one of the main themes of the 7 sins of memory is that even though I call them sins, they are, errors and distortions. One of the main arguments has always been that they, in fact, reflect the operation of adaptive processes in memory that help memory work as well as it does. And I thought, well, you could extend that to maybe all of psychology. So that sort of got me interested from a scientific perspective. So I ended up writing a proposal, and Worth Publishers ended up taking it on. Initially, it was just me, but I quickly realized this was not something I could do on my own. And so I enlisted my 2 close colleagues, Dan Gilbert and Dan Wegner, as co-authors on the project. And that's really how it got started. And so it was fun to work with the 3 of them, 2 of them. It took about 8 years to get to our first edition because we're all busy doing other things, but we eventually got it out. And so now here we are in the sixth edition. Wegner sadly passed away about a decade ago, and so we brought on Matt Nock, who is a very accomplished clinical researcher and psychologist, and our current department chair, and doing a terrific job of it. We brought him on as a co-author, and that's all. It's all worked out very well.
It's impressive.
Yeah, it is. Now, did you keep that theme of kind of errors, sins, whatever you're calling them now, throughout the book? Is that one of the...
I think it was in there a little more prominently at the very beginning. We used the term mind bugs. But, I think as the book has evolved, we've taken that explicit term out. It's still in there, and the points of emphasis, in each chapter about what we can learn about different aspects of psychology through the lens of errors and distortions, but it's not as explicit as it was in the early editions.
I think it has a distinctive niche in the overcrowded intro market, because if a faculty member has a cognitive orientation, this is the book they go to. Mm-hmm. So it's impressive to be able to capture that market share in that way. So you are to be congratulated.
Oh, thank you.
We often talk about a thematic way of teaching introductory psychology, and every few, I don't know if it's every few years or a new idea, comes up where somebody will say themes are the way to teach this course, and it is a great way to teach the course. It's very memorable, but it's neat to hear a history like this book's history, where themes have been around forever, and they do make it memorable, probably for students to have something like the mind bugs running through the thread through the book. Yeah,
I'd also like to make a comment that the sins is such an ingenious marketing way to make that work memorable. And so I'm curious, do you have a favorite sin of memory?
Wow. Interesting question. Yeah. Again, that's a really hard one for me to pick out one that I say is my favorite.
I'll tell you my favorite.
Okay, tell me your
absent-mindedness.
favorite. Okay.
Because it pretty much defines our profession, doesn't it?
It does.
Yes.
My favorite is probably bias. But I wonder, and we had this conversation earlier today, where does confabulation fall under the seven sins?
Confabulation would be a mixture of misattribution with some bias thrown in there and a little bit of transience, because most confabulators typically have a lot of forgetting. So one of the things we have to remember is any complex memory phenomenon probably taps into more than one of these memory sins. There's not typically going to be a one-to-one mapping between something as complicated as confabulation. But it's interesting that you bring that up and you say bias, because I was tilting toward bias simply because I'm literally working on a paper right now where bias is the focal point. There's a special issue of the journal Memory being put together in memory of Martin Conway, well-known British memory researcher who sadly passed away last year. And so I'm writing an article for that special issue along with a couple of my colleagues, my Irish colleagues, Ciara Green and Gillian Murphy. And it's focusing on bias and how that relates to some of Martin Conway's ideas about what he called the self-memory system. So we go through evidence concerning several types of biases: consistency bias, self-enhancing bias, positivity bias, and try to link it up with some of Conway's ideas. So it's kind of linking up the seven sins perspective with some of Conway's work. And interestingly, literally as you walked into my office, I was working on a passage regarding confabulation and how that fits in here, because Conway was involved in some interesting work on confabulation and self-serving bias, how confabulators who have had brain damage that typically results in amnesia, but also this tendency for coming up with memories of events that never happened, confabulation. Conway was involved in some work showing how confabulators tend to exhibit in their confabulations a self-serving memory bias where they're confabulating in a way that makes them look really good, and even to a greater extent than their veridical memories make them look really good. Bias I think is very interesting. It's psychologically, I think, one of the more complex ones, and I think relates to higher order aspects of cognition and self in a very interesting way.
The direction that your latest work is taking is trying to look at memory processes in connection with the future. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about that to kind of tease people's interest to get them ready for what you're going to be saying?
Yeah. This is a line of research that really actively got going in my lab about 15 years ago, but actually goes back to the Unit for Memory Disorders in Toronto that I talked about earlier. And there we were seeing a very interesting patient, not the one I played golf with, but a different severely amnesic patient who became pretty well known in the memory literature under the initials KC, who had a head injury that damaged his medial temporal lobe and hippocampus, also had some damage to frontal and parietal cortices. And although he cognitively was relatively intact, still had a normal IQ, things of that nature, he had extremely severe memory deficit. And as far as we could tell, a complete loss of what Tulving called episodic memory. He couldn't remember a single experience from his life. So back in the 1980s, Tulving was getting interested in these patients, got particularly interested in KC. And one day he and I were testing KC. I was interested at that time in things like implicit memory, which could be preserved in amnesic patients who lacked explicit memory. And Tulving was interested in the question of whether KC, who couldn't remember what happened yesterday, could he project into the future? And so we were interviewing KC, and Tulving asked him this very simple question: tell me, what do you think you're going to be doing tomorrow? And KC came up with the same kind of answer he would give you if you asked him, what did you do yesterday? If you asked him, tell me one thing you did yesterday, he couldn't come up with anything. Tell me one thing you're going to do tomorrow. He would just come up with a blank. He'd say, my mind is blank. Eventually, with some prompting, he would say, maybe I'll have breakfast, then I'll have lunch. But he couldn't conjure up any one particular episode. So that suggested, a possibly interesting link between the ability to remember past experiences and imagine future experiences. It was striking to both Tulving and I. Tulving wrote about it at various times after that, and I thought about how can we study this, possible relationship, which hadn't really been very well studied at all. The Swedish neurobiologist David Ingvar was the one who sparked Tulving's interest in this initially, who had talked about memory and future thinking a little bit back in the 70s. And then eventually in 2005, 2006, I had a new postdoc in my lab, Donna Rose Addis. I had been percolating in my mind ways that we get at this link between remembering the past, imagining the future. Donna Addis, for her PhD work at Toronto, had done some interesting studies using fMRI to look at autobiographical memory. So we started talking about, well, could we apply this now to putting people in the scanner and asking them both to remember past experiences and also imagine future experiences and look at what parts of the brain would be active during the two. And so we did a study exactly along those lines. It was published in 2007 and showed this very striking overlap in the brain regions that showed increased activity when people in response to a cue word were asked to remember a past experience or imagine a future experience compared to various control tasks. And pretty much the same network of brain regions came online, showed increased activity for remembering the past, imagining the future. A network of regions that largely corresponds to what's known in the literature as the default mode network. And so we published that paper and started doing other studies showing different, and we and others, not just us, others were getting very active in this area around that time, showing striking similarities, cognitive similarities when people remember the past, imagine the future. For example, again, another one led by Donna Addis, we looked at older adults just behaviorally in a behavioral study, remembering past experiences, imagining future experiences, and you code the transcripts of what they say for episodic details and non-episodic details. And it was very striking. We already knew from earlier work that older adults, when they remember a past experience, will give you less specific episodic detail about what happened, where it happened, when it happened, and give you more semantic information and other kinds of commentary as compared to younger adults. And then what this new study showed, what was published back in 2008, was that the same thing happens when they imagine into the future. They imagine future experiences with less episodic detail than younger adults and give you more semantic information, commentary, things of that nature. So that in our lab really got this line of work going, and we've been pursuing that for, really the past 15 years with, different kinds of experimental procedures using both fMRI and behavioral studies. And that line of work has also led to some related work on, for example, the role of memory in creative thinking, how episodic memory can be important for supporting creativity. That's something we're very active in current work. So I think it would be fair to say that a lot of the work we're doing now is focused on trying to understand the functions of memory, particularly episodic memory, and supporting other aspects of cognition. The idea that memory isn't just for going back into the past and reminiscing about what happened in the past, but it really is critically important for allowing us to plan for, think about the future, think creatively, solve everyday problems. And that's really become the focal point of a lot of the work in my lab.
When I talk to my students about memory, obviously, I'm at a community college, teach a lot of intro psych, and just like we were talking about with your intro psych book, you can't go into a lot of depth. Now, I can't actually go into a lot of depth like you could go into a lot of depth. How do you make memory accessible to your students? Or maybe a different way of asking that is in that freshman seminar class.
An example of?
Yeah. Well, you know it at such a deep level. How do you pull it up to the surface where it's accessible for your students who have never maybe thought about this?
Well, I think for me, at least figuring out a way to do that really came for me initially from writing the 2 trade books, Searching for Memory, 7 Sins of Memory, where to write a trade book to make that accessible, to an audience that's broader than just other memory researchers, you've got to link it up to everyday life and how, examples of memory doing good things and bad things in everyday life. So it's really focusing on the links to everyday life in those books, in freshman seminars, and also in the intro psych text. That's, I think, the way in to show how important it is. And, I think probably for memory researchers, the most striking or most accessible example would be, for example, eyewitness testimony. When eyewitness testimony, when it goes wrong, the consequences it can have, and mistaken eyewitness identifications are, involved in a lot of very high percentage of wrongful convictions that, people who are later exonerated on the basis of DNA evidence. And so I think, those kinds of examples can be, really important for illustrating to students that we're talking about something that's not just, an academic theoretical topic, but has very important consequences in everyday life.
That's really helpful. And I understand how writing those trade books and probably the feedback you got through the editing process was helpful for you in making that accessible to a general audience. So this question might put you on the spot, but you have looked so deeply into memory. What are some of the most interesting things, if you could capture them, one thing or a couple things that you just think are really fascinating about memory?
Well, I think the 3, from the perspective of the 7 sins, the 3 distortion-related sins are so striking that we are prone to making memory mistakes. I think that we're all intuitively aware of forgetting in everyday life because we know when we've forgotten something. It has an immediate consequence. We may be frustrated. So no one's surprised that people forget things. But what we're less aware of is that sometimes when we remember, even, with confidence, we may be remembering incorrectly because unless somebody's there to set us straight, we may just remember something in what seems like a completely accurate way, but that we know from research is not necessarily accurate. So I think it's really the fact that memory can be mistaken in its various forms that is the thing that really is most interesting to me in understanding why that is the case, because it's not intuitive in the same way that forgetting is. A nice example of that would be one of the nice examples of the counterintuitive nature of memory that relates to memory errors would be the phenomenon of reconsolidation, which is something that was kind of known back in the 1970s and then really demonstrated forcefully in 2000 in some work out of the lab of Joe Ledoux that was led by Karim Nader, showing that in experiments with mice initially, that we accept the idea that it takes time to consolidate a memory. And we feel that once a memory's been consolidated in the brain, then it's kind of there and that's it. And maybe you'll forget it over time. But consolidated memory should be sort of the end of the story. But what this work on reconsolidation showed that was not the case. And that when you reactivate a memory, that memory can go into a labile state in which it's potentially prone to disruption. And what these Ledoux lab experiments showed was that, in experiments with mice, for example, that if you remind them of a fearful event that they recently experienced, and you also inject a protein synthesis inhibitor that would ordinarily block the initial consolidation of a memory, what they found, surprisingly, was that could also interfere with the reconsolidation of a memory. So a seemingly consolidated fear memory could be knocked out by reminding the animal of what had happened and at the same time injecting this protein synthesis inhibitor. Now that, has really striking counterintuitive implications that when we reactivate a memory, we can't be guaranteed that we're just going to put it back in the same way. It may be prone to external influences, and that, in fact, may be one of the mechanisms of memory distortion in everyday life, that when you bring back a memory, you may put it back into memory in a slightly different way than you initially brought it back, depending on how you talk about a memory, other influences in the environment, and so forth. So those are some things I find pretty striking.
Thanks for that. And my final question, because I know we're at time, and Jane, maybe you have a final question or two, but you're right. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think I might have heard you earlier in the conversation mention something like this, but why isn't memory just good and accurate? And what's the advantage, or do we still have some evolving to do? I think you understand the question. Yeah.
Why isn't memory just always accurate? And why do we, forget anything at all? And so this really goes back to, the adaptive perspective on the various memory sins, including forgetting, that a variety of researchers have put forward over the years. And that's the idea that we don't really need to or want to remember every single experience that we've ever had. And so the memory system is pretty good at prioritizing what's important. We tend to encode more elaborately or more deeply experiences that are, meaningful to us and are more likely, to be something that we're going to need to recall in the future. We know that one of the most powerful mechanisms for extending the life of a memory is retrieving that memory, which can introduce distortion, but can also strengthen a memory over time. And those things that are important and meaningful tend to be the things that we bring up and retrieve. Those things that are less important tend to be the things that we're better off letting go. So I think one source of forgetting is the fact that memory is pretty good. Our memory system is pretty good at prioritizing important information that we really need to remember over time. And we're also pretty good at taking away the meaning of an experience as opposed to, encoding literally what happened. And that, meaningful information, what some people call gist information, may be the critical thing to retain. But if all we retain from an experience is the gist of an experience, then we're going to be prone to memory errors if we're, or distortions if we're asked to remember particulars that we never really paid attention to and maybe didn't need to pay attention to. So, to some extent, this view has been challenged by the really interesting observations over the last 15 years of people with what's known as highly superior autobiographical memory. These are people who do seem to remember almost all of their personal experiences, at least, with a high degree of fidelity. So we said, why can't we all be like that? Well, there's one of the answers to that traditionally has been that, well, you wouldn't want to be like that because you might be overwhelmed with, remembering meaningless events and experiences. There's a famous book published by the Russian neuropsychologist Alexander Luria called The Mind of a Mnemonist. Talked about this guy Shereshevsky, who was an unbelievable mnemonist, used memory strategies, could seemingly remember everything, but his mind was so cluttered with details that he couldn't really function at an abstract level. We wouldn't want to be like that. To some extent, people have said, well, look at these people with highly superior autobiographical memory. Most of them are not like Shereshevsky. Some are. They feel burdened by their memories and they wish they didn't have them. But most of them just seem to be happy that they, have a really good memory for most of what's happened to them. But these are people who spend a lot of time recalling past experiences, categorizing past experiences, maybe ruminating about those experiences. And that might be the reason why they have the exceptional memories that they do. Because again, if you're someone who's just spending a lot of time retrieving your past, that retrieval is one of the most effective ways of slowing down forgetting over time, which seems to be what happens in these folks. They don't have a photographic memory, but they are able to, they have a slower rate of forgetting for their personal experiences than do the rest of us. And that in turn may be attributable to frequent retrieval, which perhaps most of us are not really that interested in spending that much time in retrieving our past experiences.
When you talk about the people you've worked with over the years, decades, these are human beings who must be just, some of them fascinating to meet and to think this is the experience that this person is having. It must, and now I'm sure that you've seen a lot at this point, but I'm also wondering about, you've dealt with a lot of people who are in suffering states because of what they are going through. Now, I know you're a researcher and you approach these questions scientifically and all your research, but what is it like to work with people who are having amnesia or whose loved ones are suffering because of that? Has that ever gotten in the way of your work, or how has it affected your work?
Well, that was really an issue that was most relevant or more relevant to the early part of my career, because I really haven't done much with in patient-related work really over the last couple of decades. But certainly in the 80s and 90s I did, and I, particularly at Toronto in the Unit for Memory Disorders, interacted quite a bit with patients and their families. And with the patients themselves, it would depend on the nature of their condition. So some patients are, only minimally aware of their memory loss and not too troubled by it. I mentioned earlier the patient KC, who had almost zero memory of his personal past and couldn't imagine into the future. He had some awareness of his deficit, but only limited. Other patients do have more awareness and are troubled by it, and can be very upsetting to work with them. But I would say it's more so the families and the caretakers who are really the ones who are the most troubled and upset and have difficulty dealing with that particular condition. And so I think it would be interactions with them that I always found, the most affecting. Although there were some patients were, very aware and troubled by their memory deficit. It's kind of a myth that if you're amnesic, you would forget that you're amnesic. That's not necessarily the case. And amnesic patients who have damage, for example, to the hippocampus, medial temporal lobe, critical structures for memory, but don't have damage elsewhere, they can be very much aware of their deficit. The ones who are unaware tend to have damage out in the frontal lobes and other regions. But I always found it more the caretakers who were really bearing the brunt of a lot of the memory problems.
As we bring this to a close, I just want to mention that I was really pleased to see the penetration of the 7 sins throughout every intro book, and not just because of what it tells us about how memory operates, but the meta lesson of it helps people be more humble. And if there's one goal that we'd have in trying to have as many people take intro psychology as possible, it's to develop some suspicion that you have an absolute 100% handle on the truth. Mm-hmm. And I think especially this content is really useful to drive that message home. So I want to thank you for that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I've always felt that way about what, one of the important lessons of those 7 sins are, and just that it's a relatively straightforward mnemonic that gives you some organization right away on
and no surprise,
right?
There. Yeah,
on an important aspect of memory.
Well, Dan, thank you for sitting down with us, giving up your valuable time. Oh, we've kept you a long time. Thank you for that. And we want to just wish you the best in your continued research, with your writing and your book sales. And we hope that all of this gets out to more students, especially in intro psych, but beyond, because we know that sometimes, generally, our students who are taking intro psych aren't even going to be psych majors. They're going to go into other areas. And so to carry these kinds of lessons forward is life-changing. It really is. So thanks again for doing this, and thanks for your time.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it, and thanks for visiting.